Today, we're going to kind of take our step back, look at the big picture of what's going on with shipping, including taking a delve into some past stories that we have not followed up on. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. All right, let's take a look at those past stories. So, making the news this week, the motor vessel Dali. You may remember back in March of 2024 when the Dali took out the Francis Scott Key Bridge, killed 6 bridge workers up on the structure. Well, we've got a follow-on report to this. Now, we've covered this in a lot of detail. This video really broke down the NTSB report. But this story over at GCAP by Mike Schuller, the state of Maryland has finalized a $2.25 billion settlement with the owner and operator of the container ship Dali. The agreement resolves claims brought by Maryland against Singapore-based Grace Ocean Private Limited and Synergy Marine Partnership Limited, the owner and operator of the Singapore-flagged motor vessel Dali, which struck the bridge on March 26. Now, this final figure exceeds the roughly $43.7 million liability cap sought by Grace Ocean and Synergy under the Limitation of Liability Act of 1851. This act, which is still around, basically said that if you cause an accident or an accident befalls a ship, you cannot get more money from the ship than what the value of the ship was worth. So the $43.7 million is basically the leftover money of what Dali was worth after the collision. Now, this was done back in the day of age and sail and early steam. Obviously, it had its place and not really anymore. It'll be interesting to see what happens with the Limitation of Liability Act after this. The settlement was reached only weeks before trial proceedings were set to begin over whether the vessel owner and operator could invoke those protections. The agreement resolves Maryland's claim against the ship owner and operator, but the state has reserved claims against additional potentially responsible parties, including issues tied to the vessel design and modifications. The legal and technical battle surrounding the casualty intensified further this week after federal prosecutors unsealed criminal charges against Synergy Marine related management entities and technical superintendent Radhakrishna Kartik Nar. Sorry if I absolutely butchered that name. I should also mention that parts of the crew of Dali are still being held in Baltimore because of the accident. There's a lot of issues surrounding the vessel, not the least of which is the cause, which was traced back by the NTSB to a loose signal wire in a high voltage switchboard that initiated the cause of the blackout. The collapse shut down the port of Baltimore for weeks, disrupted regional supply chains, and forced more than 34,000 vehicles per day onto detour routes around the harbor. The total economic damages tied to the disaster have been estimated at between $5 billion, while replacement costs for the Francis Scott Key Bridge are projected between $4.3 and $5.2 billion, with work expected to be completed around 2030. If you're following what's been going on with the bridge, nothing has literally been done, it seems. And so the settlement with the Dali case is an interesting one. That's one of the highest settlements we have ever seen. And the question is going to be what happens to the crew and these follow on. This is going to be going on for a long time. And claims against Dali and the companies could be astronomical. I mean, to this day, if you're diverting around Baltimore, you could potentially sue Dali for that diversion and the additional costs associated with it. Another story we talked about, get them off the damn boat. We talked about the Hana virus that broke out on board the cruise ship Hondas back earlier this month. Now, I got a lot of flack for this story for a variety of reasons, and I understand why. I mean, one of the things that people were telling me is like, Sal, stay in your lane. You're not a medical doctor. You should not be talking about this. However, I should note that I was reached out to by medical doctors involved in this case. Specifically, they were coming out of New Mexico, which sounds like a weird thing because the ship was at Cape Verde in the Atlantic. The ship had come from Antarctica. Why somebody from New Mexico calling me? Well, hantavirus is very prevalent out in the Four Corners region where New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona come together. This is really the best place that studies hantavirus. And one of the things they were worried about was it morphing into this variant that can be spread by humans. Basically, it goes airborne. And one of the worst things that can happen is to keep those crew and passengers together in a confined space. Hence the reason to get them off. The ship had set sail for the Netherlands late on Monday evening with 25 crew as well as a doctor and nurse. All passengers have disembarked. The ship is expected to arrive in the Netherlands by May 17th. 3 people have died since the start of the outbreak on the ship, which is usually spread by wild rodents but can also be transmitted person to person in rare cases. The WHO on Monday said there are now 7 confirmed cases of the Andes strain of the Hana virus and 2 other suspected cases. 1 person who died before being tested, 1 on Tristan da Cunha, a remote South Atlantic island where there are no tests available. So the key here was getting safe refuge for the passengers. And the reason I brought it up is because we've been seeing this issue happen regarding ships. Countries are not allowing safe refuge. And yes, Cape Verde, a small island, doesn't have a lot of resources to it. However, you have to, under international treaty, provide this, whether it's a medical outbreak or it's a hazardous material incident on board the ship. This is something that, again, must be addressed. I mean, we have to do it because the safe nature of the crew and the passengers was obviously a paramount. There was not great danger in spreading this to the population of Cape Verde. One of the big dangers was you were going to kill 150 people on the ship, and that was really the big concern. According to everyone I've talked to and everything I've read on this virus burns through very quickly. It doesn't transmit beyond, second, third iterations. So if you quarantine them, and more importantly, it's completely treatable. It has a high mortality rate of about a third, but if you're treating the patients, the mortality rate drops. It's untreated that's the problem. IVs, respirators, those are what you need. The other issue that we want to talk about here, story we've been talking about a lot, is the crews in the Persian Gulf. Yes, we're not going to talk about the issue in the Persian Gulf per se, but we have been talking about the plight of the merchant mariners. Our Week 10 recap focused on the plight of the merchant mariners, particularly the crew on board CMA CGM San Antonio coming under attack. But this story over at Lloyd's by Josh Minchin, Strait of Hormuz, vessels are stuck, but seafarers are not. The situation for those on board vessels stuck in the Middle East Gulf, that is the Persian or Arabian Gulf, has improved in the past few weeks. Thousands remain aboard in stressful situations, and the supply infrastructure had all but collapsed in the days following the start of the war. However, that situation has changed. Crews are being rotated out. They're being flown home. There are airlines available through the UAE and several other countries. And most importantly, a supply infrastructure has been established to get food, fuel, and water out to the ship. So I know a lot of people were asking about this situation. It was an early one we reported on because of the situation out there, but it's gotten better. However, the threat still emerges out in the strait and in the Gulf about attack. So it's nowhere near safe for the mariners on board the roughly 900 ships that are out there. Another story we talked about had to do with this vessel, the MSC Baltic 3, that went aground in Newfoundland on February 15th, 2025. Is it really 2025? I thought it was a ship's been aground for over a year off the coast of Newfoundland. Oh, really? Yes. Been aground for over a year. It's going to be aground for probably 2 years. That's how bad this situation is. But let's talk for a minute about the absolute cojones on board the crew, on board the Canadian Air Force Cormorant that did that rescue at the time. Both men and women, fantastic operation by them. I mean, that was stellar. They went in there and pulled that crew off. But Mediterranean Shipping Company, that's the owner of the Baltic 3, has really been poor to terrible on the salvage of this vessel. This story comes to us from Maritime Executive. The removal phase of the salvage operation for the wrecked container ship, with the goal of clearing as much as possible this season, but possibly not finishing until 2027. In a briefing hosted by the Canadian Coast Guard on May 4th, they reviewed the plan that had been presented for the removal of the vessel. MSC Mediterranean Shipping Company and its insurers ran a tender and selected Resolve Marine for the second phase of the process after TNT Salvage oversaw the removal of the fuel and cargo. The new contract was awarded on April 7th, and as of May 1, Resolve Marine has begun overseeing the caretaking and monitoring operation. It reports it is working with TNT and already has the first of its crew on site. I will say this, I know people at Resolve Marine. They are a top-notch salvage operation. They are the ones who did the salvage of Dali in Baltimore, particularly regarding the bridge removal and aspects of on board the ship. They have done high stake operations in the past. I think they are the right group to get in here. I just hate it's taken this long to get Resolve Marine on here. This has been an ongoing process. You cannot allow the ship to remain this long. The ship's breaking apart. I mean, there's no way to float it off. So they're going to literally have to break the ship into pieces and remove it from the area. It's just a terrible position for Newfoundland to find themselves in. Then we have the story of the Arctic Mega-Tsunami. This is the LNG carrier that was attacked in the Mediterranean, we believe, by uncrewed surface vessels hit on the port and starboard side. This vessel was probably subjected to attack by Ukrainians in the region. We don't have solid evidence of that, but more than likely that is what happened. You can see the blowout on the port side of the vessel here from early on. The ship has become a hot potato between Libya and Malta in the Mediterranean. Now, the ship is now anchored off Libya's eastern coast, potentially ending a 2-month drift across the central Mediterranean. Satellite imagery and maritime tracking shows the tanker holding position about 18 nautical miles north-northeast of Benghazi. The development follows a chaotic period since early March when the vessel was reportedly hit by a Ukrainian sea drone while transiting about 150 nautical miles southeast of Malta. The blast forced the crew to abandon ship and leave the vessel adrift with a cargo of liquefied natural gas and fuel on board. The vessel was temporarily abandoned during these operations according to a notice set out on April 23rd, but by April 28th, a Libyan harbor tug had managed to anchor the vessel offshore, according to sources familiar with the operation. Sentinel-1 satellite images from April 3rd confirmed the tanker's position. Now, while most of the gas on board has probably leaked off, there are still significant questions remaining over the vessel's condition. Arctic Mega-Tsunami has also had wider implications for Russian energy shipping. Since the explosion, Russia has rerouted its shadow fleet of LNG carriers away from the Mediterranean, opting instead for longer voyages around southern Africa to avoid potential security threats. Now, this follows the sinking of Ursa Major back in 2024. When this was occurring, there was a spat of Russian ships that were sinking in the Black Sea and around the world. I joked about it on my channel. It was very akin to what happened in the Hunt for Red October, where they lost another submarine. And that video got me into an interesting discussion with H.I. Sutton over at Covert Shores, where I tend to fall on what is the most plausible explanation for a ship. And Russian ships have notoriously bad maintenance, bad operations, and so I put that akin to probably an engine room problem, an engine room disaster that resulted in the engine room flooding, an explosion in the engine room that eventually leads to the loss of the ship. Well, news story comes out, this is from AP, that the Russian ship that sank near Spain in 2024 may have carried nuclear reactor parts, but more importantly, it may have been a target attack. Again, we have that Arctic Mega-Tsunami being hit by an unmanned surface vessel in 2025. Could that have been a target for the Ursa Major? Potentially. It could have been struck by an unmanned surface vessel. I don't think it was torpedoed. I think if you torpedo a ship, the damage is much different than what you see on Ursa Major. I'm not sold on this either right now. I think there's too many questions out there. The ship we know was carrying the covers for nuclear reactors. We thought they were carrying the covers for nuclear icebreakers being built in Vladivostok, but now rumors are that those nuclear power plants that could have been on board the vessel were being carried for North Korean submarines. You would not transport those by rail. They're too heavy, so you put them on a ship, and Ursa Major is a big heavy lift vessel, a perfect vessel to do this style of operation. So a lot of updates right off the bat there on past stories we have looked at. Let's go ahead and go to our second story. So let's talk about one of our favorite topics on this channel, containers. Containers move the bulk of the world's goods in terms of manufactured, finished products, along with some raw material around it. And we move a buttload of containers around the planet, over 100 million every year. And the container sector has always been a very volatile one, as we have followed on this channel. One of the big stories we looked at historically here was the global supply chain crisis. Well, this story by Mike Schuller over at GCaptain. Global container spot rates posted their sharpest weekly gain in months as carriers pushed through emergency surcharges and capacity cuts amid rising geopolitical disruptions and signs of an early start to the peak shipping season. So let's take you over to that Drewry World Container Index. Now, this is not a rate that you pay to move containers. It's just a composite of all the rates around the world. You see this big spike back in mid 2025 that had to do with tariffs, and then the repeal of the tariffs, and all of a sudden we saw a huge spike happen in terms of shipping. What we're seeing right now is this huge uptick right here. So if you go back to April of 2026, we're looking at about $2,200 as part of the WCI composite. Now we're at almost $2,500. If we look at it broken down from Shanghai to four major ports, Rotterdam, Genoa, Los Angeles, and New York, you can see that same upward tick. We see the Rotterdam kicking up. We see the Los Angeles kicking up. Massive change going into Genoa. Genoa is really significant because you have to go around Africa to get into Genoa because of the diversion from the Houthis. And then same thing here into New York. You can see all those individual rates kicking up with about 2,400 for Rotterdam, about 3,400 for Los Angeles, 3,700 to Genoa, and a whopping 4,200 going to New York. Now, at the same time, we're getting the Q1 reports in from all the major carriers. So, for example, container shipping giant Hapag-Lloyd reported a sharp deterioration in first quarter earnings on Tuesday, blaming severe weather disruptions and conflict in the Middle East for rising costs and weaker operational performance as the shipping industry grapples with another volatile year. They're looking at an EBITDA of about $494 million for the first quarter of 2026. That's almost a 60% reduction from where they were a year ago. Hapag-Lloyd said lower freight rates, severe weather disruptions across Europe and North America, and the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz late in the quarter weighed heavily on results. Meanwhile, we get this story from Lorianne LaRocco that the Port of Los Angeles reported strong results in April, but the report's head warns that high energy prices are hitting the trucking community hard. April was the best month of 2026, strongest since last August. The nation's largest port handled 891,000 container units, up more than 5.5% from year-end and 18% from the previous month. Gene Soroka, executive director at the Port of LA, quote, "This ranks as our second best April on record. What's driving this is the American consumer. They are still resilient, still spending." The problem is going to be cost for diesel. Diesel prices are up 50% here, and most of the 1,200 companies that do trucking business in and out of the Port of Los Angeles are small businesses, and we define those as 5 rigs or fewer. It's a direct impact. Now, some are trying to pass that cost on through the supply chain to importers and exporters, but they also have to compete with the big trucking firms. We're seeing that. We're seeing the rate per mile increasing from about $2 a mile up to $3 a mile. And plus, we're getting much more stringent control over independent trucking than before. There was a big crackdown on who's getting their CDLs, their commercial driver's licenses. That's having a massive impact on the drayage. This is the short-term trucking or short-haul trucking coming out of the ports. That also impacts long-haul trucking coming out. And this goes in concert with this story out of Bloomberg. Supply chain stress that peaked in COVID heads higher again. The following dashboard of logistics activity shows that some gauges are at the highest since the 2020-2023 period, when economies locked down, shortages emerged, and shipping snarls persisted. So what are those metrics? Well, the Fed gauge. Fresh strains are reflected in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's Global Supply Chain Pressure Index. After going quiet for the past 3 years, it has risen for 3 straight months. The World Bank Global Supply Chain Stress Index is flirting with its pandemic peak. This measure focuses on fluidity in container shipping and ports and looks at larger vessels that typically sail long international routes. Vincent Clerc, the chief executive officer at AP Moller Maersk, explained on Bloomberg last week how the world's second largest carrier will adapt to an extra $500 million in monthly costs expected through the second quarter. Well, that's easy. They're going to pass it along to you, the consumer. That's exactly what they'll do. And then the Japanese PMI, Manufacturing Purchase Managers Index from S&P Global, has reached the highest since January of 2022. In the U.S., delivery times in the Institute for Supply Management report has lengthened by the most since 2022. Another U.S. metric flashing inflationary signs is the Logistic Managers Index, a monthly survey distributed by Associate Professor Zach Rogers of the Colorado State University. The latest LMI shows pressure in mounting places. Warehouse capacity is tight everywhere and shrinking at the quickest pace since March 2024. Jason Miller, a professor at the supply chain management at Michigan State University, crunches numbers on shortages. He said the ISM number for the U.S. showed a bit of an uptick, with 6 commodities identified to be in short supply. That includes aluminum. That's a key factor that we see in global transportation, bearing and electronic components, semiconductors, and industrial chemical called propylene glycol. The picture looks even dicier in Germany. German chemical and plastic makers, quote, saw the largest increase in the shortage of materials last month, said Miller, while automakers and parts producers reported a bit of a jump in shortages, but nothing beyond historical norms. All of these are really indicating shortages and potential problems in the global supply chain, something we should be aware of. That's a great story from Bloomberg, really recommend it. And then at the same time that that's going on, we're having pressures being exerted against the global supply chain by the Federal Maritime Commission over their issues of charges that were netted during the global supply chain crisis. This story over in Lodestar. Shippers will be watching with bated breath following OOCL's decision to challenge the $45 million fine it was handed by the Federal Maritime Commission. The carrier is appealing not only the amount of the reparation, but the FMC's jurisdiction to hear this case. Last month, the regulator hit the carrier with the fine after finding in favor of bankrupt U.S. shipper Bed Bath & Beyond administrators Butterfly One, which claimed OOCL's service during the pandemic was not in accord with service contracts or refusal to deal. This is a major case. The amount of money is nothing. $45 million is a drop in the bucket to OOCL, but what they understand is if the FMC makes this case stick, then the FMC, the Federal Maritime Commission, will be in a position to bring more charges against them, and that is the big issue. If the FMC has the ability to level these charges and to get restitution for the charges leveled against the carriers, in this case OOCL, and more importantly the shipper, Bed Bath & Beyond, then all the surcharges that are getting ready to be incurred right now due to elongated travel rights because of increased fuel costs, that is an issue that they see as a problem. And therefore, this $45 million challenge is a big one. And I'm looking at it with bated breath to see what happens. And that goes hand in hand with that first story about the rise in the Drury Index. If the carriers, the big ocean carriers, can put on these surcharges and charge these rates without any sort of, check and balance, that is the problem. If Laura DeBello, the new chairperson of the FMC, can lead her agency to provide a check against the carriers, and remember, the U.S. is the largest importer in the world, then the companies will have to rethink about how they go about weighing these surcharges and how they make up the additional costs that are being leveled upon them. Remember, the carriers were screaming at the beginning of 2026 that this is going to be an awful year, that we're expecting the lowest profits ever, yet I'm going to wait and see what the Q2 numbers come in, because while Q1 was low, now all of a sudden, because of Hormuz, expect to see those numbers jump back up again. What we've seen since the global supply chain crisis is how the ocean carriers can make profits, unlike they've been able to do in the decade before. All right, let's go ahead to story number 3. For our third story, the U.S. Navy has unveiled a $65.8 billion shipbuilding push to launch President Trump's Golden Fleet. Now, this is part of what's called the 30-year shipbuilding plan. The Navy issues this every year. They're required by Congress to do it. This year, they kind of jazzed it up a bit. I will give them this. It looks a lot nicer than it typically does. I don't think this is a new shipbuilding plan. I think it's just a 30-year plan repackaged. But there's a couple of key things in this shipbuilding plan. This is what the Navy calls the FIDIP. This is the 5-year, basically, shipbuilding plan. And what you see here is the allocation of money in millions of dollars. This is a buttload of money here. This is a grand total over 5 years of $268,071,000,000. So we're talking about a lot of money. So what are the big kind of cost items that are in here? Well, a authorization for a new nuclear aircraft carrier in FY 2029. The first of the Trump class battleships. We just did a video of Zach Cooper and John Conrad debating the battleship, and what you're seeing in the fit up here is in 2028. $17 billion authorized for the first battleship, with two others authorized, one in 2030 and another in 2031. We're still building Arleigh Burkes. I mean, we're going to be building Burkes until the end of the world, I think. I'm seriously, I've seen so many jokes about this. It's crazy. But 7 Arleigh Burke class destroyers. One of the things that's really important to note is that this plan also includes the first retirement of the Arleigh Burkes. And this is really important because we are not going to be building Burkes fast enough to replace the ones that retire. We're going to see the overall number of destroyers go down, because there was a point when we were building 3 a year, and we're never going to get back to that. You also see the first frigate in here, or FFX, one in 2027, and then 3 more throughout the program. More Virginia-class submarines, 2 per year for a total of 10. Some District of Columbia-class boomers. These are the big ballistic missile submarines, 1 each year for a total of 5. 2 large deck amphibious vessels, 5 LPD-17s, 23 landing ship medium. I've got to say, what the frick are we doing with this? The landing ship medium is $6.8 billion. How are we going to use these things? You cannot use these things in the Strait of Hormuz, the Persian Gulf, and yet for some reason we think we're going to be able to operate these things in the first island chain with China. Again, I would rather take that $7 billion and build large deck amphibs or something else than these LSMs. I just don't think that these are really good. We see 7 fleet oilers in there, the first of the smaller next generation logistics ships. 5 what are called Tagos boats. These are sonar surveillance vessels, and 2 desperately needed submarine tenders are in this authorization. So that is the major combatant vessels that you see in the authorization. Now, one of the things that I thought that the shipbuilding plan lacked was a commercial version to come out at the same time. I would have loved for the U.S. Navy and the Maritime Administration to release their commercial shipbuilding plans along with the Navy's shipbuilding plans. I think that would have been perfect. That would have been a great coordination. We didn't get that. But we did get some kind of commercial shipbuilding in the U.S. Navy shipbuilding plan. You'll see here the construction of 2 oceanographic survey ships. You see the construction for 2 replacement hospital ships. Listen, I love the hospital ships. The USNS Comfort will always have a special place in my heart. I sailed on that ship. I met my wife on that ship. I love that ship to death. But good God, that ship is old. It really needs to be replaced along with Mercy. We see the purchase of used roll-on, roll-off ships for strategic sea lift. I think the $260 million in there could be used for better things than building or buying used ships. I really do. I vehemently disagree with this right now. I don't think that's what they need to be doing. Plus, there's another $100 million to convert. I mean, that's $360 million to convert these ships. I mean, that gets you 2 ships. I would much rather be investing in ship construction, which they have there. 5 new construction sea lift vessels, $2.2 billion for that. I should note, back in the 1990s, we got 20 sea lift vessels, 15 new builds, 5 conversions for $6 billion. I don't like building ships to go into the reserve fleet. I don't like buying ships that just sit and rust. I would rather be building ships that we can use actively, and I think a repurposing of that money should be discussed. And then you see a really interesting one here, $2.2 billion for 5 console tankers. This should be the build and charter. That's the model we want. Build these ships to go out there. We're seeing right now the demonstration of how we need sea lift vessels to support the Navy in the Indian Ocean. Did a whole video on logistics. And a key thing here is what we call consolidation tankers. That to me is really, really important. And so we get some sea lift in this building program, but nowhere near enough. At the same time, we get this story over at GCAP, Mike Schuller. The U.S. Coast Guard's ambitious Arctic fleet expansion took another major step forward Wednesday as Davy Defense announced it has finalized a $3.5 billion contract to build 5 new Arctic defense security cutters with construction split between Finland and Texas. Finland is an acknowledged builder of icebreakers. Helsinki shipyard in Finland is a key one. The new Gulf Copper facility in Galveston and Port Arthur is a great team up. Start building them in Finland, morph over to the United States, start building them. This is all part of a plan to build eventually 11 Arctic security cutters for the U.S. Coast Guard to get them back up into the Arctic, to get down in the Antarctic, which I think is key. This is, again, a good element for it. And then the last one, which came out last month, but it's being developed even more, is the idea of nuclear-powered commercial shipping. On Thursday, Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy and the U.S. Maritime Administration launched a new initiative aimed at developing small modular reactors for commercial vessels. Now, this is a big upfront cost. This is going to be expensive as crap to do this. However, in the long term, if you put a small modular nuclear reactor, this is not a nuclear plant in a Virginia-class submarine or even in a Ford-class aircraft carrier. This is a much smaller reactor. It does not involve the size of crew that you need to maintain a nuclear reactor on a combatant vessel. This is different. If we can develop this over the course of its lifespan, 15, 20, 25 years, you save money because you're not fueling. You don't have the carbon emissions. And most importantly, we developed the program here in the United States to train those engineers, to put them on the ships, and to recycle them at the end. I think this is really a big thing. We have to start thinking about replacing commercial ships in the U.S. service, particularly those ships in the coastal trade, the Jones Act tankers that I talk about a lot. Why not put modular nuclear reactors on them? Put them on the Jones Act tankers. Those ships then are operating in the coastwise of the United States. You don't have to worry about getting permission to dock them in foreign countries. More importantly, those ships generate power. When they come into port, they can plug into shore power, not to pull power from shore, but to actually pump power into the grid. They provide emergency power for communities. I think this is actually a area that the U.S. needs to think about much more. And again, I think as President Trump arrives in China to meet with Chairman Xi, this is a key thing because we're already seeing calls by bipartisan groups for President Trump to prioritize American shipbuilding and avoid concessions to China during this upcoming session. Both Republican and Democrats are talking about this. The Trump administration has mixed messages on shipbuilding. They talk about shipbuilding being a priority, yet at the same time, they've just issued a 90-day waiver on the Jones Act, extending a previous 60-day waiver. They say buy American, yet here we have foreign ships coming into the U.S. coastwise to do it. And I'm not saying we shouldn't wave ships in during this emergency, because there is issues about this. But a lot of the emergency is being driven not by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. It's being driven by things like California closing refineries and cutting over 10% of their refining capacity. It's being caused by fuel speculators offloading gas, diesel, and jet fuel out of the United States overseas to find a higher price point than within the United States. There's a lot of issues at play here. And I think that the call for President Trump to be strong on this issue, remember, one of the reasons for U.S. shipbuilding renaissance is because China has so dominated the market. And the reason Korea and Japan are interested in building U.S. ships in their port is because they're getting hurt more so than the United States by Chinese shipbuilding. All right, let's go ahead and head to our next story. So the next story deals with the Arctic, and one of them is really disturbing for me because I just recently did a cruise up to Alaska. So this story by Mike Schuller over at G-Captain, a massive landslide in Alaska's Tracy Arm Fjord triggered one of the tallest tsunamis ever recorded, sending water 481 meters, about 1,578 feet, up to the opposite wall of the fjord in what scientists are calling a climate-linked near miss for the cruise tourism. Now, in this August 10th, 2025 event, the landslide generated an initial 100-meter breaking wave traveling more than 70 meters per second, followed by a mega tsunami that stripped vegetation from the steep fjord walls. No one was killed or injured, but scientists said this was largely a matter of timing, with the landslide striking in the early morning hours when no cruise ship or large number of visitors were in the immediate area. What the frick? Seriously? A 1,500-foot wave? This is. I mean, that is terrifying. I gotta say, most of the movies where you see tsunamis and the ocean, first of all, you never see a tsunami in the ocean. Like, Poseidon Adventure things, that doesn't happen. It's like a little lap wave that comes across, which is a tsunami in the ocean. Tsunamis only happen in shoaling waters. You've got to have shoal water for that to happen. And, where tsunamis have an impact, which they do, don't get me wrong. I mean, you saw that in 2004 in Indonesia. When that wave comes to land and it sucks the water out, it gets higher. That's where it happens. If you had a cruise ship in the fjord when that happened, that would have been a disaster. I mean, I'm not kidding. That is terrifying. That is a terrifying issue. Now, I'm not trying to scare anybody off from an Arctic cruise, but man, that could give you some pause there for a moment. That's a scary story. So Lorianne LaRocca over at GCAPN had this story about the icebreaking season for the U.S. Coast Guard. Ice conditions in the Chesapeake and Mid-Atlantic waterways was characterized as significantly above normal compared to recent decades. Operations wrapped up on Thursday. The U.S. Coast Guard estimated that more than 50 million tons of ice were broken this winter. Peak ice coverage in the Chesapeake Bay reached over 35%, which is the most since 2014 and greatly exceeds the seasonal average of around 10%. Now, the Coast Guard icebreaking fleet includes heavy, medium, and light icebreakers, tugs, and ice-capable buoy tenders. There are more than 600 nautical miles were impacted by ice up on the Great Lakes, on the Hudson River, and in the Chesapeake. Total ice coverage on the Great Lakes reached a 7-year high of 58% on February 9th. Within 2 weeks, the Coast Guard saw ice coverage expand from 5% on January 14th to a whopping 51% by January 31st. Lake Erie reached 95% ice coverage. Lake Erie is always the one that ices first because it's shallow. It's the most shallow of the Great Lakes, so that's why it ices. There's always the one. It will never get 100% because of the massive churn caused by the Niagara Falls. So you don't ice over at Niagara Falls. That would require like day after tomorrow style cold for that to happen. But the Coast Guard fleet was put on record service this year. And again, I never think the Coast Guard gets their due credit at all. I think they hit way above their weight. They are doing things like ice breaking on the Chesapeake, on the Hudson River, and up on the Great Lakes. Meanwhile, they're shooting out motors of drug runners in the Caribbean, and they're rappelling on tankers in the Indian Ocean. I mean, it's the most awesome service in the United States, the Coast Guard. I'm sorry, it just really is. Sorry to everybody else out there, Army, Marine Corps. I know Marine Corps always thinks they're the best, but the Coast Guard is absolutely the most awesome. And Space Force, you've got a lot of work to do to get up there. I'm sorry, you do. You're never going to be as cool as the U.S. Coast Guard is. Sorry. For our last story, we want to talk about energy, and there's quite a few here to cover. This story by Malt Humford: Europe's rush to quit Russian pipeline gas has created a new energy vulnerability, growing dependence on U.S. liquefied natural gas, as war-linked supply disruptions in the Middle East push the continent deeper into reliance on seaborne fuel. So this data comes from the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, which says that Europe is on track to source roughly 2/3 of its LNG imports from the U.S. in 2026. U.S. imports into Europe have more than tripled since 2021, with forecasts that U.S. imports could source 80% of Europe's LNG by 2028 or 2029. This all has to do, obviously, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and efforts to get Europe off the teat of Russian liquefied natural gas. Now, the problem with that is it's going to be difficult because they're talking about being off Russian liquefied natural gas by the end of the year. The evidence to that is not great. Even as Brussels pushes to phase out Russian gas imports, Europe is importing more Russian LNG than less. Russian LNG imports into Europe rose 16% year on year. France has become the clear symbol of that contradiction. The country imports more Russian LNG than any other European buyer in the first quarter, with 35% of its LNG coming from Russia, while accounting for 41% of Europe's total Russian LNG imports. So this story coincides with another one that Malt wrote. European Union imports of Russian Arctic liquefied natural gas from the Yamal LNG project hit a record high in the first 4 months of 2026. The EU imported 6.69 million metric tons of LNG from the Russian Arctic project. Between January and April, up 17.2%. The imports represented 98% of the Yamal LNG. 98%. I don't know who's getting the other freaking 2%, but 98% is going to them. So, while Europe is talking about getting off of Russian LNG, they're sure not looking like that, and that is a big issue. It goes with this story from Maritime Executive. U.S. set to become Europe's largest gas supplier, overtaking Norway. So, U.S. is overcoming Norway's pipeline gas advantage by dint of the rapid development of the U.S. Gulf Coast LNG plants, as well as the sudden unavailability of Middle East supplies due to the Iran conflict. This all deals with Qatar, that is cut off and it can't export. We just saw a second LNG carrier come out of the Persian Gulf, but this is a drop in the bucket compared to where they need to be. And the lack of Qatari LNG coming out is forcing the world to shift to other LNG. And what we're seeing is Europe is doing this. Now, Russian LNG is a really interesting one because they love shipping it to Europe. It's a quick sale. If, however, they do get cut off, they're going to have to go longer distances. We talked about this the other week with Russia buying 4 LNG carriers. That is to put on the Arctic route because they want to go the Arctic route because that's a shorter distance to Asia. If they've got to go all the way either through the Suez or around Africa, that's way too long. They've got to maximize their ship capacity. They want to have the minimal amount of ton miles. At the same time, the U.S. is exporting like crazy out of the U.S. LNG plants on the Gulf Coast, but that's a longer distance to get to Europe, not to mention the fact that U.S. LNG is also being pulled to Asia through the Panama Canal, but there's constraints on the Panama Canal. You can only get 10 ships a day through the big lane. This is why they're having the toll through it. And then the last energy story is a really interesting one is President Trump is in China to meet with Chairman Xi. Iranian oil afloat is keeping China well buffered. This is from Maritime Executive. Now, assumption is made that China, without supplies on its own, is critically dependent on oil imports. It is true that China does indeed have a large appetite for crude, but less well appreciated is that China generates 85% of its energy needs from its own internal resources, including nuclear, coal, and wind power. So China has some flexibility. It also maintains reserves equivalent to about 150 days of consumption. It goes on here, Iran might be feeling the pinch given that between 80 and 90% of its oil exports are sold to China, but China will not be overly concerned about the predicament Iran finds itself in and has no need to expend political capital to resolve the crisis in the Gulf when its impact on the Chinese economy is yet relatively limited. The general analysis of the situation is beginning an interesting twist by research conducted by Muyu Zhu, a senior crude oil analyst at Kepler. Her research has found that oil exports to China from Iran have indeed dropped from 1.71 million barrels per day in March to 1.16 million barrels per day. But as yet, the deficit is not being drawn instead from the 155 million barrels of Iranian crude held afloat outside the Gulf. Chinese importers are either needing less or getting extra stock from Chinese reserves. Hence, the 155 million barrels of Iranian crude held afloat is still largely intact as a buffer, meaning that China is not feeling this pinch very hard. They've just gotten their second tanker out of the Persian Gulf, yet at the same time, a Chinese ship was seized by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. This is a security vessel, a vessel that ships meet to load a security detachment with weapons on board. So not exactly clear why that's happening. That's a developing story right now, but we'll follow up with that. So 5 stories across the board there. A big recap. There was a lot of stories I've been meaning to get to, and I apologize for not being able to get them. This episode meant to cover a lot of areas that we have not been able to cover because of Hormuz. We talk about global shipping. I know it's not just what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz channel, but I wanted to be sure to cover that. Obviously, so much going on with containers, with energy, with the Arctic, with U.S. shipbuilding and shipbuilding globally. We will try to do our best to cover more of it. And I say we, it's me. It's just me. I'm a one-person show here, so I will do my best to get you more coverage coverage of topics. Heading into the summer here, done at Campbell University for the year. Grades are in, graduation is done. Looking forward to the summer. Got some trips coming up this summer, but we're going to keep coming at you with what's going on with shipping. And if you can, hey, support the page. How do you do that? Well, number one, subscribe to the channel. Hit that subscription button. Trying to get over 700,000 subscribers. Almost there. It's a big hurdle for us to go through. I didn't think we would get 7,000 subscribers. It's crazy that we're at 700,000. But please subscribe. Hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come in. Share it across social media. Share it across to your neighbors. Hey, there's a great channel about shipping. You should go watch it. Please share it. I am on all the social media platforms. We're obviously on YouTube, but we're also on Blue Sky. We're on Twitter. We're on Facebook. We're on LinkedIn. We're on all those platforms for you. If you can, give it a big thumbs up. You can support the page by hitting the super thanks button down below. That contributes directly to the page. I got to pay for subscriptions to a lot of these news sites, and it just helps me offset the cost for the channel. And of course, if you can, go over to Patreon, become a monthly, yearly subscriber. I appreciate the patrons who support us. It has grown over the years. I'm hoping this summer to do some retooling, get this channel into a way that I feel is being more supportive to those who view it on a consistent